at the end of service, I realized something was going on. And sure enough, I had the dreaded disease. So hopefully I didn't spread it to anybody. I was trying not to. But I'm glad to be here this morning. It's good to be here, and I'm glad you're here. It's always a joy to be in the fellowship of God's people, is it not? It's a refreshing, joyful thing to experience that, and I'm glad you're here. Hope your year's going well so far. Hope it continues in grace, and God blesses you richly in all things as we continue along. So in Mark chapter 9, we're picking up again where we left off last week. I'll tell you this, next Sunday we have some special guests who are scheduled to be here. They were scheduled to be here back in before Christmas to lead us in worship. Kenny and Claire Hilliard will be here next week and lead us in our service in worship, and looking forward to that. They are from Tennessee, and they are a couple who will be bringing the music and testimonies and maybe even preaching a little bit. So invite your neighbors, invite others to be here. We'll be looking forward to that. So make a note of that, all right? We will enjoy it. So we were talking about radical or extreme Christianity. It's a shame that what is considered radical and extreme by many today really in the scriptures is considered normal. While these are not inspired things, I tell you what, the world is an amazing, interesting place right now. Things are happening, I don't know if you're paying attention. Things are happening in a way that you better be paying attention. They're happening quickly. Things are changing in ways I never thought they would change. Things are being done. Now, whether you agree with it or not, it's not the point here, and I'm certainly not making a political statement. But did you ever think that stating the fact that there are only two genders would be considered radical? I never thought that. My goodness. Did you ever think that making sure that we are choosing qualified people, no matter what their skin color or background, would be radical? No. When I was growing up, if you didn't qualify to do the job, I didn't care what color you were, you couldn't do it. They got somebody who could. These are just examples of how far we have gone from common sense. Now, that's not a political statement, ladies and gentlemen. Please don't shut me out if you think I'm making a political statement. I'm not. We've lost our ever-loving minds when it comes to some things. Nonsensical idiocy is what has been foisted upon us. And such is the case when it comes to Christianity. There's a thought process today that literally preaches and teaches that a person can come to Christ, remain unchanged, live the way they've always lived, and turn to Him and go to heaven when they die, regardless of what their life of disobedience says about their faith. I'm here to tell you, that is nonsensical idiocy. The Bible demands from us a radical and extreme discipleship. And it's not extreme according to the Bible. It shouldn't be extreme to anybody who loves God or loves His Word. But in our world, to be a true Christian and to follow God's commandments and to be devoted wholly unto Him is seen by the world as a radical and an extreme thing. Now, we looked at the first part of this last week, and in verse 42, we brought out this point, that Christians are called to be extreme in the way we love other people. The motivation for love is what stands out here in this verse. And whosoever shall offend one of these little ones that believe in me, it is better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and he were cast into the sea. What a horrible death that would be. But Jesus is making a point here that you are to love others to the degree that you will not do anything according to your own whims and desires or even your liberties that would offend another believer and set them back in their faith. Now, he had just brought little children to himself, and he is using them as an object lesson, but he's not specifically only talking about children here. Now, don't get me wrong. Abusing a child should be, to me, a capital offense. It should be very serious anyway, it is. But that's not really what Jesus is getting at. The little ones he's using to present as an object lesson, he's using them to represent God's little ones. You and I, all of us are God's children. And so what he's saying here is that you'd be better off to die a horrible death than to offend another Christian in their faith. Set them back in some way. Now, sometimes truth offends. We can't help that. And that's not what he's saying. But he's saying is you do not take upon yourself your rights, your liberties, what you can do in a way that would offend somebody, and you not mind that or care about that offending them. We are to be radical in the way we love other Christians. In other words, what I want really is to come second to what's best for other people. That's a tough thing to live by, especially in America. That doesn't go over too well because, we're all about us. But there's another area. He's going to make 4 statements here. I want to talk about this statement today and probably bleed over to next week because there's just too much here. I taught my Sunday school class today that I get to preach against sin. Yes, right? Every preacher likes that sermon on sin. This one is on sin today because the next thing Jesus says in verse 43 is that we are to be extreme in the way we pursue purity. Look at what he says in verse 43. And if your right hand offend you, cut it off. For it's better for you to enter into life maimed than to have 2 hands to go into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where the worm dies not and their fire is not quenched. And if your foot offends thee, cut it off. It's better to enter into life halted than to have 2 feet to be cast into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where their worm dies not and the fire is not quenched. And if your eye offends you, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter into the kingdom of God with 1 eye than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire, where their worm dies not and the fire is not quenched. I can't think of anything more extreme than what I've just read to you. And I hope the impact of what he says and how he means it here is not lost on you. If you and I were to walk into our living room and to see something like an Australian inland taipan on your living room floor, deadliest snake in the world, 1 bite has enough venom to kill 100 full-grown humans. My wife wouldn't have to worry about being bit. She would be dead before I could deal with a snake. It would scare her so bad, and her repulsion and reaction would be so much. Would any of you invite your children into the living room and show them what a pretty snake that is if you knew what it was? Some of you are crazy enough to play with snakes anyway. But I don't think you play with this one. Sandy, you play with snakes, man. You're nuts. But anyway, you wouldn't even pick this one up, would you? Your dad probably taught you how to do that. But if you knew what this was, you would pick it up. You wouldn't give it to your grandsons and say, here, boys, come here and hold this. No, why? Because you know it's deadly. You know that 1 bite would kill you. It has the potential to kill your entire family. You wouldn't play with that kind of a creature. Well, the irony is that we, even as Christians, sometimes make the mistake of playing with things that will kill us. Not just hurt us and make life difficult, but literally things that could kill us spiritually. When Jesus talks about dealing with sin, he's building on what he's just said. If you love other people, he says, you'll not do things in a way that will offend them. If you love other people, as he's continuing the thought process here, the thought stream, he's saying that you will do your best to live purely so as not to offend them or hurt them or lead them in the wrong direction. We don't often see love for other people cast as the right motivation for living a pure life. But if I read what Jesus is saying here correctly, this may be the greatest motivation. When I think, and I told you this last week, when I think of why I don't do certain things, almost, and I'm certainly not the example. I hope this is always one of my greatest motivations, other than loving and pleasing God, is that I would never want to sin in a way that would hurt my family. I don't want to sin in a way that would hurt my wife. I don't want to sin in a way that would hurt you. I don't. And I'm sure you feel the exact same way. If you feel that way, if you think that way, then you're approaching the right kind of motivation that Jesus is communicating here. So now he's telling us how serious it is that we guard our purity. I talked about radical, extreme things earlier. You know, the world sees any kind of a claim to want to live a pure life as an extreme, radical thing. I heard someone recently making fun of the idea, and it hasn't been that long ago, that, you know, the whole purity movement took place among youth groups and youth conventions and that kind of thing. It's a shame that has to be a special emphasis. That should be normal in the way we think. I've got news for you. Young men, young women, it's not okay for you to have sex with someone before you are married. It's not okay for you to view that as normal. It's not okay for you to pursue that as a normal thing. It's not okay for us as parents to come to peace with that. It's not okay for us to say, I want my child to be happy. So they can commit adultery or they can commit a fornication. It doesn't matter as long as they're happy. It's not okay to think that way. If you think that way, you might as well pick up that Australian inland taipan and hand it to them. Now, that's not a guilt trip. We're all sinners. We know we are. And I'm not pointing out anybody because I don't know. I don't know your personal life. But I am saying this. We have come to the place where legalism has repulsed us. And I'm repulsed by legalism. Man, in Sunday school this morning, I told them how bad I hated it. I hate somebody's list that's outside of God's word. I hate it when somebody judges me based on their list. I have enough trouble keeping God's commandments that are in the Bible, what God has said, much less what somebody down the road thinks or says, right? And so I'm repulsed by legalism. But we've come to the point, being repulsed by legalism, that we have abandoned biblical purity principles. We've come to have peace with that kind of thing. We are at peace with alternative lifestyles. We are at peace with unbiblical things. And we have forgotten that those things kill and they maim and they destroy. If I know one thing for certain, it's that Satan wants to destroy us all. He wants to destroy our families. He especially wants to destroy our children. He wants to ruin and wreck their lives. Now, Jesus is telling us how to guard our own purity. Because if you and I are not pure in our lives, we can never lead someone else toward being pure. If one's own heart is impure, conversely, it will always lead somebody else to be impure. Therefore, Jesus calls for this radical, extreme, severe way of dealing with sin. So the first thing I want to mention from this passage, I want to point out the importance of killing sin. I take that phrase from a man by the name of John Owen. He was a Puritan pastor from centuries ago, 17th century England to be exact. And here's what he said. He said, where sin through the neglect of mortification meaning put to death. That's a good word, by the way. Put that in your vocabulary and throw that on somebody at work tomorrow. Have you mortified your sin lately? Well, they talked like that back then. And he said, this neglect of mortification gets a considerable victory. It breaks the bones of the soul. Wow. You think sin hurts? Yes. It breaks bones. It destroys families. It creates wounds that are never healed. It can't be undone. God's grace forgives and covers all. But that's no excuse for those of us who know him to pursue it, right? He continues and says that when poor creatures will take blow after blow, wound after wound, foil after foil, never rouse up themselves to a vigorous opposition, they expect anything but to be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin, and that their souls should bleed to death. I think he's right. The New Testament agrees with him. Very quickly, I'll just point out some. For Paul says in Romans chapter 8, for if you live according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Spirit you're putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. In Colossians chapter 3, he says, therefore consider the members of your earthly body, the members of your body, dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. I will add Titus 2. Christians are to deny ungodliness and worldly desires and to live sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age. Peter says in his first letter, chapter 2, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. So it's a biblical pattern. It is a biblical principle that we pursue purity. Killing sin is important. As a matter of fact, it's part of the process of sanctification. Sanctification is, if we were to reduce it and boil it down to one overriding principle, the killing of sin. That's where it starts. But we can't end there. We know it's important, but there's a process to killing sin. Now maybe you're here this morning and you have in your life a repeating cycle of disobedience. Doesn't mean you're lost. Doesn't mean you're going to hell. There is a process for mortifying or killing sin. Now here's how Jesus puts it. He said, if your hand is what you're using to sin, cut it off. If your foot is causing you to sin, cut it off. If your eye is causing you to sin, pluck it out. Now, what's he saying? Well, he's using hyperbolic language, which is extreme language. Does Jesus mean literally, that you are to cut off your hand or cut off your foot or pluck out your eye? I don't think so. I think what he's advocating, what he's commanding is really in many ways more severe and much more difficult. Anybody can have their hand cut off. There are those who interpret this literally, and listen, there are people who've done some crazy things to try to overcome the desires and lusts that are inside of them. The problem is that to eliminate ourselves of the offending member of our body does not eliminate the inward desire, because that's where sin begins, and that's where it has to be attacked. Now, what he's saying here is that your hand, your foot, your eye, all of those things emphasize that the battle against sin includes all aspects of your life: what you do, where you go, what you see. right? And the right hand, as we all know, was, especially in those days, was seen as one of the most important members of our body. It was a source of strength, and to lose it was to lose a great deal of one's strength. So he's not talking about physical mutilation. He's talking about you've got to attack it at its source. Now, what's the scripture say about that? In Mark chapter 7, Jesus has already said something about it. He said, that which cometh out of the man, that's what defiles the man. For out of the heart of men proceeds evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, evil eyes, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile the man. It's not so easy to cut that out, is it? It'd be easy to go under the knife and have that removed. Wouldn't that be great? I'd sign up for that operation tomorrow. Right? You would too. But that's not how it works. James adds, and we often don't consider this verse in that light, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust has conceived, and it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. The writer of Proverbs, chapter 4, says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Our sin bubbles up from inside of us. The source is our fallenness, and that is the source that has to be attacked. Now, every one of us would have an easy time making up our list today of what sins need to be killed. I think we play and we dally and we compromise with sin. You can list any sin you want to. There are some people who will treat attending worship as an unmandatory thing. It's optional, I should say. Is that a sin? Yes, it's a sin against God. Does that multiply itself? Yes, it does. Why does a person not have a desire to be in the congregation of God's people? There's a problem on the inside. We live in a generation, young people have been raised with a phone in their hand that gives them access to things that some of you older gentlemen would have to go into some very seedy and dark places to see. Now your child can look at it in their own bedroom, in the privacy of their own bedroom, in the darkness before they go to sleep. That's the world we live in. What would Jesus say to this world? He would say, you've got some hard choices to make. He would say, stop playing with the sin that besets you and is pulling you down and holding you back. How would I apply that practically? Well, I can't always say I desire not to be a Pharisee, and I don't have my own list, but as far as God's righteousness is concerned and what Jesus says, there are some things that could be eliminated from my life that would go a long way in killing sin. You say, Pastor, you mean I should cut my internet off? If that's what it takes. Yeah. You mean I should cancel my cable subscription? That's what it takes. Yeah. You mean I should let my wife know everything I look at on the computer? I hope you're doing that already. But if that's what it takes, yes. Anything that is leading us into sin, there are practical things we can do that will begin to attack the source that is bubbling up within us. There's a process of sanctification. I will deal with that later. I'm going to save that till next week. But I want to bring you to this last thing this morning, and that is the urgency of killing sin. This may be funny to you. Someone sent me this week. It's one of those, y'all seen the cards where, I guess it's always attributed to a Chinese all-you-can-eat buffet. And they hand the man a card. You've been banned from our buffet. You've eaten too much. Please leave immediately. We won't make a fuss. You've seen that, you know. Well, this one says, church potluck. You have been cut off Please leave quietly and no one will know. Your body is a temple, not a garbage disposal, right? Hey, is gluttony a sin? Yeah. How do you overcome gluttony? Well, I'll let you know when I figure it out. You have to attack it, right? We play with things like that. We ignore, we put them down lower on a priority list as if they don't matter. But they do. Now again, I'm not a legalist. I don't have a list. I'm trying to stay inside the bumper rails of God's word here, all right? Just things he has commanded. But what is the urgency? And here's what I want to press home before we leave today. It trips some people up that Jesus talks about hell. Some people take this passage and say, man, if I'm a Christian and I mess up, then I'm going to go to hell. Is that what Jesus is saying? Well, the rest of the Bible refutes that. The rest of the Bible, when brought to bear on this passage, destroys that idea. But why would he mention hell? What does he say? He says it's better for you to enter into life maimed than to go to hell. It's better for you to enter into life halt or lame than to go to hell. It's better to enter into life blind than to go to hell. What does he mean by that? He's not warning us that if we sin or fail, we're going to lose our salvation and wind up in hell. But here's what he means. The present tense that he uses here, the verb that's translated here in this passage, indicates rather that the struggle against temptation and sin is continual. When we get saved, that part of us, yes, there are new desires. We are made brand new, but there's a residual aspect of our fallenness that clings to us in a very bad way. It's a ball and chain. It'd be wonderful if when we came to Christ and we were converted that all that went away, but it doesn't. I have seen people have victory immediately over certain sins, and I have seen other people struggle. There are addictions, there are things that affect us in biological ways that the residual consequences and effects remain, and it's a battle in some cases for the rest of a person's life. So what's he saying here? Number one, there is no salvation that's real apart from a heart that seeks after righteousness. A person who is not at least engaged in their life in the process, to whatever degree, of overcoming their sin. The person who has no grief in their heart over sin. The person who cares not if they offend others or God. They can say they're saved. But I think what Jesus is saying is, you're just showing that you're not. The threat of hell is for those in whose life is not seen the desire to kill sin or to overcome sin in their life. You realize how many multitudes of people are sitting in Baptist churches today who are being made to feel very good about themselves because they came up and shook a pastor's hand, or they joined a church, or they're part of this ministry, part of that ministry. But in their life, there's this overwhelming outflow of sin. It may be hidden from everybody but them and God, and they have no desire to do anything about it. What's that showing? Showing a state of non-conversion. Showing a state of lostness. What is the end of every lost person? Hell. Now the word he uses here is not just any old word for hell. It's Gehenna. And we're not talking about the holding place of Hades. We're not talking about that. When a lost person dies now, they go to a place that the scriptures refer to as Hades. It's not the final hell. You realize that, right? The final hell is the place called Gehenna. It's a lake of fire where torment does not end. It's no joke. And a person's life that is never marked by repentance is headed for hell. Gehenna was the valley of Hinnom. It's a place where the kings of Israel, back in the days of the Old Testament prophets, were led by the Canaanite religions around them to sacrifice their children to the god Molech. And so it is said that in that valley, as they exercised those religious services, when they were sacrificing their children, they would play drums loudly so the cries of those children who were being cast into the fire would not be heard. It was a black mark in the history of the nation. And eventually, the Valley of Hinnom became the garbage dump outside of Jerusalem. And what do you do at a garbage dump? We don't do it so much now, but back in that day, you kept the fire going always. Always. It never went out because you're always having to consume the waste and the garbage that had been brought there. And Jesus likens that. He uses that word for hell because in hell, the fire never stops. It's never quenched. It's 24/7. It continually is operating in God's judgment. It never stops. We've even dumbed down the idea of hell. Sin in your life and mine doesn't belong. Why? Because by God's grace, if we are true children of God, we're not going to hell. But the person who lives as if they've never been changed is not changed. And I don't have a problem saying it. They are going to hell. That life of disobedience says, I have no desire to follow purity. I have no desire to protect anybody. I have no desire to please God. Inside of me is the same old desires I've always had, and I'm chasing them as hard as I can. That person can talk about some Bible school moment or altar moment when they were 10 years old till they are blue in the face. They are not going to heaven. They're bound for hell. That's the urgency. I'm not the judge. Jesus is, but he's the one that says it here. He's the one that lays it out here. That's how urgent it is that we pursue purity. These words, in my estimation, are the strongest call to true discipleship that Jesus ever gave. If you're serious about following Jesus, on your radar always has to be the sin that needs to be killed. It can be a sin of the tongue. Think about the sin of the tongue. You can cut it out, but you're still thinking it, right? It can be a sin of lust. It can be a sin of greed. It can be a sin of lawlessness. It depends. Name it, whatever it is. If we are not cognizant of it and attacking it with the ferocity that Jesus outlines here, then we're not really serious about following him at all, are we? No. So in summary, let me make these summary statements, then I want to tell you a story and we're done. Living impure lives is a sign that we do not love other Christians because of the potential harm it will cause them. Number two, striving for purity is a lifelong pursuit, is a sure sign of a redeemed heart. You won't ever get there completely. But the fact that you're fighting tells you there's something inside of you to make you want to fight. Conversely, ignoring purity is a sign of an unrepentant heart. Number three, sin is the most dangerous enemy of the human soul. There's nothing more dangerous for you or your family than sin. It seeks to capture, bind, even kill whenever it can. And number four, the only way to deal with sin is to be continually killing it. John Owen put it this way. I referred to him earlier. He said, be killing sin, or sin will be killing you. And that's the truth. Now, I'm not just up here hoping that my words will be heard trying to get this over with and yelling at you for a little bit about sin. Every pastor, every preacher preaches against sin if he's worth his salt in any way. And this is not just a general thing, but I'm here to leave you with this idea of how dangerous and how radical our response to it must be. If you remember reading of King Saul when he was ordered to go and defeat the Amalekites, maybe you remember what happened. Saul was tasked by God to go and to destroy the Amalekites. God actually came to him and said, Saul, I've got an assignment for you. I want you to go to the Amalekites. I want you to destroy the kings, the politicians. I want you to destroy the men. I want you to kill the women. I want you to kill the babies. I want you to kill every animal. I want you to kill everything that is living among the Amalekites. Leave nothing alive. Now, we read that today. We think, oh, my goodness. Why did God tell him that? Because God knew, as in other cases, that those Amalekite cultures, or those Canaanite cultures, I should say, were so engrossed and steeped in sin that destroys, that as sure as they brought one item of that culture into their culture of Israel, it would spread like leaven and bring destruction and sin to them. So God said, kill them all. You say, why did he say kill babies? Because God knew those babies would never turn to him. Is that harsh? Yep. But that's how serious sin is. That's how destructive. That's how dangerous it is, destructive. So Saul returns from the slaughter of the Amalekites. He goes and he whips up on them pretty good, but Saul does something that God told him not to. Saul saves some of the livestock. Saul saves some of the people. Saul saves the king of the Amalekites, whose name was Agag. You remember that? Now, he thought he was doing everybody a favor. And so Samuel shows up after Saul comes back from that victory, and Samuel says, Saul, I thought God told you to destroy everything. Saul said, well, I have honored the Lord in his request. I destroyed most of the Amalekites. I destroyed most of their livestock, except I kept the best. And the people who were with me decided we'd save the best and bring it back and sacrifice it to God. We thought that would be the right thing to do. And on top of that, we've saved Agag so that we can humiliate him more. Samuel said, I thought you obeyed. Saul said, I did. Samuel said, well, what's that lowing of cattle and sheep that I hear? Saul, you haven't obeyed. And he said, do you not realize that God wants obedience more than he does these sacrifices? You remember that? But then what Samuel does is what illustrates what Jesus is saying. Now this is harsh. This is Old Testament as it gets. But let me explain something to you. The effect and consequences and danger of sin are the same today as they were in Saul's day. They haven't changed. And God's reaction and God's view of sin is the same as it was in 1 Samuel 13. I want you to keep that in mind. Because what Samuel does is he says, Saul, bring Agag to me. And they brought Agag. I can see him up on the platform. All the people are gathered around. Samuel's a prophet. He's a man who fights with words. Except on this day, Samuel picks up a sword and looks at Agag and he says, you will be childless and cut off from your people, just like you have cut off others from their people. And then it says this, Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord. When's the last time you and I have hacked a sin to pieces because of the threat that it was to us? Some of you, and people you know, pastors, playing with things that have eternal consequences. I've told you the Bible doesn't spell out, thou shalt not do certain things. But there are some things that will offend others to the point that we ought not to do them. And then there are those things that the Bible actually says don't do. We treat both the same. Oh, well, I'm under grace. I can do whatever I want to. No. Your obedience and my obedience is proof of whether or not we really know Christ. Now, again, there's no guilt trips here. There's all kinds of degree of toleration and compromise that we have. And you're the only one who knows your problem. I'm the only one who really knows mine. And I'm not standing here in judgment. I'm standing here in encouragement to pick up the gospel sword and to hack it to pieces. You say, Pastor, this is extreme. I know. You say, Pastor, you're making us out to look like, backwards, bumbling idiots. I know. And to state this and to live like this, the world's going to look at us like y'all are crazy. I know. But I can't change what Jesus said. How serious are you? Every one of your kids ought to be hearing this, right? They need to hear this. Now, can we be victims of sin? Oh, yes. But we better not be the perpetrator. What am I calling for? I'm not calling for anything. But I hear Jesus calling for extreme commitment, extreme discipleship, to the point of being viewed as irrelevant by the world. Does that matter? No. Will it cost you? Oh, yes, it will. But will you be glad you did one day? Yeah. What's the alternative? Listen, parents, for us, I think, to me, and I'll say this again, the greatest threat is the things that I allow in my life, that I don't deal with in my life, will almost surely spill over in the lives of my children. And if I see that spill over in their lives, there's not a thing at that point I can do about it in their lives. Nothing. How many parents have watched children be destroyed? Their lives be destroyed because of their refusal to deal with their own sin. Again, we're all in the same boat. Not a one of us here today is sinless. Not a one of us. But if you're a true child of God, we're all called to the same thing. Radically, extremely, kill it. Now, next week, I'm going to walk us through. I just feel like I need to do this. I'm going to walk us through John Owen's, I think, 7 or 8 steps of killing sin. It's so good. I want to share it with you. You don't read stuff like this anymore. We want to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. You're under grace. God's forgiven you. Yes, he has. But when we know and are warned against this danger to begin with, where does that leave us? Forgiven but hurt and damaged and wounded. God doesn't want us wounded and damaged. So I'm asking you this morning, take this seriously. Get serious about your commitment to Christ. Stop halting, as Elijah would say to them, those people on Mount Carmel. How long are you going to be halting and crippled and limping between two opinions about this? Either sin will kill you, or you can be at peace with it. There's no in between. There's no in between. If you're serious, you have to kill it. I want you to stand with me, please. Heads bowed, eyes closed for a second. Maybe it's just